Welcome to Solosaurus, a podcast about one-player board and card games. My name is Brandon Waite.
My name is Carter Mackey.
And this is episode 14, where we're going to be talking about a different kind of Lovecraftian horror game, The Fate of the Elder Gods, which has you playing not as the investigators who are trying to stop one of these elder gods entering the world, but as a cult member trying to summon the god. So, pretty cool twist on a very familiar theme. So we'll get to that game in just a few minutes. But first, let's talk about some of the news that came out of Gen Con. The first bit of news this week is some industry news, and that is that Stronghold Games and Indie Boards and Cards have actually merged. So this is a pretty big deal. Indie Boards and Cards is a big company. Resistance and Coup and other games like that have really bolstered their sales. You can find them in Target and Barnes & Noble. Anyway, they feel like a very large company to me, but apparently Stronghold Games has gotten quite large as well. I mean, games like Terraforming Mars certainly don't hurt that. They've had success with the Uwe Rosenberg tile-laying games like Indian Summer and Spring Meadow, things like that, Cottage Garden. And all of those have helped them a great deal. So yeah, this makes them one of the larger publishers in the industry now. So congratulations to both of them. This is a pretty big deal for the industry. The second bit of news this week is there's a new roll and write game called Railroad Inc. from Horrible Games, who have published this in conjunction with CMON. Roll and write games are the hottest thing going in board games right now. And in this one, you have sort of a dry erase board in front of you and your train tracks and roads on the board using dice that are rolled for everyone to use in the middle of the table. And what's interesting about this to me is not only was it apparently one of the hot selling games of Gen Con this year, it also comes in two different versions, a red version and blue version. And my understanding is that the main difference between them is that the red version has Charizard on the cover and the blue version has Blastoise. That's not true.
Right.
Yeah, it's not true at all. But they are actually different. So apparently they're the same core game, but if you buy the blue version, it has 2 or 3 exclusive solo variants that use 2 blue dice in the game. If you buy the red version, it has 2 or 3 exclusive variants that use the red dice. So it's kind of an interesting sort of thing. If you want the full Railroad Inc. experience, you have to buy 2 copies of the game. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen this done quite this way before.
Yeah, I've seen like variant box art, but not, I guess, 2 different variants.
Yeah, I think you could also buy a Nintendo proprietary cable and hook up your 2 copies of the game and trade the variants if you want.
Right, of course.
So if you're interested at all in roll and write games, check out Railroad Inc. The other big game surprise at Gen Con this year that nobody was expecting to be there, and I don't think had been officially announced, is that Weta Workshop, who is now making board games after they made a giant robot fighting game last year called GKR Heavy Hitters, GKR standing for Giant Killer Robots, that had amazing production values.
Yeah, I would assume.
Maybe the coolest looking miniatures I've ever seen in a board game. Fully pre-painted, awesome looking things. Well, they're making a game now based on District 9, which has me totally pumped because it has the same awesome graphic design that GKR Heavy Hitters had, but with District 9, which is one of my favorite sci-fi movies maybe ever.
Oh, I just didn't realize that was one of your favorite.
Yeah, I really love it. I think it's awesome, and it's an interesting idea to make a game based on this. Yeah. I don't know exactly how you do that and actually keep the spirit of the film, but it seems like an interesting thing to try.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see, and I'm sure everything in it will look amazing.
Oh yeah. Some of the reviewers who were there who actually got a chance to demo the game showed some pictures of the minis. It looks awesome, and it's coming to Kickstarter, I think, later this year or early next year, so keep an eye on that. The next big game that at the con this year was Root from Letter Games. And if you haven't heard about Root, this is a very interesting game because like its forebearer, Vast, it has 4 asymmetrical factions that players can play. And when I say asymmetrical, I think probably what a lot of you have in mind is like slightly different starting powers. But what Letter Games sort of prides themselves on is making games that are completely asymmetrical. Like, you're playing almost 4 different games, but then they all sort of integrate together and feed off of one another. It's a great concept and the sort of thing that seems like it would be strictly multiplayer, but there's actually an official solo variant available for the game that comes in the expansion. I contacted Patrick over at Letter Games and asked him a little bit about the solo mode and whether you actually need that expansion to play it. And he says you do not, that it's very easy to proxy that and to find the print and play files online that you need in order to be able to play it solo. And so if you have a base copy of the game or you're interested in the game, but you don't really want to shell out money for the base game and the expansion to see how it plays one player, now it sounds like you don't really have to. So check out Root from Letter Games. Our final bit of news this week is that Fantasy Flight announced Arkham Horror 3rd Edition, which is a bit of a surprise to me because I sort of thought that Arkham Horror was done as a board game. Eldritch Horror came out, became very popular, does sort of the same thing but better, and then they made Arkham Horror the card game, which has become hugely popular. But I don't know, I was interested to see this. It looks very different. Have you seen pictures of this?
No, haven't seen it at all.
It has a modular board now.
Ooh.
Yeah, so totally modular tiles for the different places in town connected by little strips.
Mm-hmm.
It almost makes it look like a space station. It's a major overhaul of this design. A lot of the people who really love Arkham Horror had pretty negative reactions to the way this looks, but they're also a pretty hardcore crowd.
Right, yeah, that's the impression I've always gotten.
So I'm not particularly interested in this for myself because I really like Eldritch Horror and Mansions of Madness, and that's a lot of Lovecraft for me. Those two games do similar things already, and I definitely don't need Arkham Horror and Eldritch in my collection.
Yeah, that seems like a lot.
If they follow the same path they followed with Eldritch Horror and Arkham Horror before it, what they'll do is release this game, and then before the base game is ever out, they'll announce 3 expansions for that.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll each contain their own sideboards, so you'll end up having a game that takes up 4 tables in order to be able to play everything.
So with it being modular, do the different tile modules just add new locations to go to? Is it still like location based?
Yeah, it's still location based as far as I can tell. Maybe it's scenario based and it changes that way now. Or maybe you just deal out a certain number of random tiles and that's what you have to work with. I'm not 100% sure. I haven't seen a lot of details on this. But if you're interested in Arkham Horror, you should check it out because this is a major move, at least sideways, if not forward, for the game. Speaking of Lovecraft and many tentacled things, it's now time for us to go ahead and get to our review this week, which is for a game called The Fate of the Elder Gods. And that's from designers Christopher Kirkman, Daryl Lauder, and Richard Launius. This comes to us from Greater Than Games and Fabled Nexus, and it plays 1 to 4 players, so it has a solo mode right in the box. And this is a hard game to explain, sort of an action selection area control game where instead of fighting Elder Gods, you are actually summoning them. And we'll get more into how the game actually plays in just a little bit, but first we're going to talk a bit about components. So Carter, what did you think about the components for this game?
Yeah, I really like the components a lot. I thought it has kind of a round octagonal type board that's just different and cool. I mean, the minis aren't like, they're not varied. Like everyone has the same looking cultists. They're just different colors, but everything looks cool. Like the main Cthulhu type tentacled monster that you move around as the location marker. The investigators are all the same like action posed woman with a gun and fedora. Yeah, I think it's
probably
a
fedora.
Right. You know, that action pose with a revolver. Anyway, yeah, I liked it. I mean, the art's like pretty solid. All the components feel and look good, I thought.
Yeah, I was surprised because when I saw this a couple of years ago when this game first came out, I think it came out in 2017, I remember seeing this and thinking, number one, who needs another Lovecraft game?
Right.
And number two, thinking that the cover didn't do anything for me really, just when I saw it digitally. Looking at the cover in person, I'm wondering how I could have ever thought that. This is a really awesome cover for the game. One of the things I like about the components for this is that it mixes sort of a matte finish with a high glossy sort of finish to make certain elements in a picture pop. Mm-hmm. And not only does that happen on the cover with the tentacles reaching out for the cultists who are summoning whatever monster they're summoning, but also the board itself has that. These little, I don't know what you call that.
Yeah, high gloss over certain points of interest, like the astral symbol for each area.
It looks great.
Yeah.
The whole thing looks very bright, actually, for a Cthulhu game. The middle of the board has this cool swirling portal called the Abyss.
Right.
which is great. The artwork on all the locations is awesome. And like you mentioned, there's only one sculpt for the minis, but there's so many minis, and they're pretty well made and heavy, good quality.
Right.
The cards are all linen finished, and I don't know, I was really impressed. Oh, and the dice that come in the game. I love these dice.
And there's lots of them.
There are lots of them, but they're really well made, and I don't know, when I opened this box, I thought, wow, this is much nicer a game than I thought I was going to get. And I'm sort of surprised that it has flown under the radar because almost nobody talks about this game.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about it, I think, before.
Yeah, I'm surprised because it's a really nice production and has a very interesting theme because you don't really see any games, where you're playing the cultist trying to summon Cthulhu, or at least I haven't. And then on top of that, the rule set for it is very simple.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to pick up the game and get into it quickly. And there's a surprising amount of depth here, I think, considering the brevity of the rules.
Yeah, because the only thing, there's nothing hard about the rules, but there's kind of a decent amount to remember with what all the locations do, and they kind of have dual actions to some degree, or there's two actions you could possibly take, and it's hard to remember what everything does, like, in the beginning. It has nice little player aid cards that, is the easy reference to refresh your memory on it all.
Oh, yeah, I meant to mention that during the component section. I thought these were some of the better player aids I've ever seen in a game, and which is helpful, especially for a game that has action spaces that do specific things. Until you know the rules well, the symbols on the board aren't actually that helpful for you.
Right.
So I thought those were great, and yeah, I did have to flip through the rulebook a few times in my first game just to see what the different spaces did, but that goes away pretty quickly. And overall, I thought they were well done. There are a few things in the rules that were a little bit more vague than I wanted them to be. Well, I don't know if that's true. I don't think this is a fault of the rules necessarily, but the flow of the game is just different than any other that I've played. And so wrapping my head around how the game actually was supposed to work on the table was more difficult than figuring out whether I was allowed to do a thing. I felt like I knew the mechanics of it when I started playing, but then I sat down at the table and I thought, I've never played anything quite like this before. The timing of it is a little different. Yeah, it's an interesting rule set. They're well done, but it's just an odd game that's hard to categorize.
Right.
And there are solo rules included here in the book. And we'll talk a little bit more about the solo game in a minute, but I will say one of the things I really like about this rule set is that we're talking less than 1 page of rules to get you started for solo. It's very similar to the base game.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very simple. So they've done a really great job with the components and with the rule book. And when you actually start playing the game, I think what you're going to realize is that a lot of the elements here are familiar. There's area control, there's action selection, there's hand management type things in the game, all of which we've seen other times. But the way they meld here is just different than anything else I've ever seen before. And part of the reason for that, first, is how you actually use the cards. The whole point of the game is you're trying to summon one of the elder gods. And you have this little player board in front of you that has a little summon track. And you're trying to do things on the board that will ultimately advance your token on the summon track. You want to get all the way to the end before you get 5 curses. Or before your track fills up with elder signs that are placed by investigators who are coming after you and your cult.
Right, and sealing off your means of summoning.
Yes. And the way you're going to actually do the things you need to do to advance that token to win the game is you're going to start the game with a handful of cards that have these different astral symbols on them that make an appearance in pretty much every Lovecraftian game ever. And you're going to discard one from your hand in the location where you are. You'll put it next to that location in order to move your main fate piece, is what it's called.
Yeah.
It's just sort of it looks sort of like a Cthulhu pencil topper.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's not actually, it's sort of hollow at the base in a weird way that I've not seen in other games. But you move it there, that's sort of showing where you're taking an action that turn. And when you get there, you do a couple of things. You're going to take the action of that location, and you're going to place an investigator on that spot. And this is where the game starts to get kind of interesting, because over the course of the game, the more times you take a particular action, the more investigators are going to appear at that spot. And that means a couple of things for you. Number one, if you are taking an action at this space, you have the option also of taking like a second stronger action at that spot, or like a stronger version maybe of the base action. As long as you have more cultists in that space than there are investigators, and as long as you have at least 3 cultists in that space. And that's a pretty interesting little puzzle for you to figure out, because over the course of the game, every time you take an action to go somewhere and use a location action, you're placing one of your cultists down, but you're also placing one of the investigators. So they're at least keeping pace with you, essentially, as you build up a force there. And then on the AI's turn, if you can even really call it an AI, I guess you can.
Yeah.
Their piece is going to move to a location on the board. And when that piece stops there, not only does it block you from taking that action, it also plops another investigator down onto the board. And then if there are ever 3 or more of these investigators on the space when you come to take the action, they're going to go to your lodge, which is sort of your home base where you're conducting all of your ritual activities. And then if there are ever 5 or more cultists on your lodge, they're going to conduct a raid. And that's when they'll start laying elder signs down on your summoning track and trying to stop what you're trying to do. So it creates this really interesting puzzle, because you really want to take any action on the board that you feel like taking. But at some point, after you've taken actions a few times, you're going to notice that the investigators there are starting to build up. And it'll cause you to stop and think, okay, do I want to take this action badly enough that I'm willing to have the investigators notice what I'm doing and come to my lodge? Because sometimes you'll still do it.
Oh, yeah.
But it's just that there's a price to be paid in order to take that action. It's pretty cool and very thematic in a way that I find compelling. I've never played a game like this before and was worried about what the investigators were doing and whether they noticed what kind of activities I'm doing. I don't know. It's just a neat way to flip the tables for this.
Yeah, I think thematically they really pulled off well. Just the idea of building a cult, or just having cultist activity at all these different places and being more conspicuous or not.
Yeah, and it actually feels like it in the game, I think.
Right.
This is one of the few games I played recently where I was pretty pulled into the theme as I was playing. So I really like that aspect of it. The other thing that's interesting here, though, is that if you build up that majority in the space where you have 3 or more cultists and you outnumber the investigators, then you get that second stronger version of the action, which is you're going to need to be able to pull that off a few times in order to be successful in the game, I think.
Yeah, I would say so.
But if you don't have enough investigators in the space, you have a chance to still get temporary control of the space, where basically you just roll some dice, and if you get enough of the right symbols to be able to do that stronger version of the action. So it's still a possibility that you'll be able to do it, but there's a bit of press your luck involved here. If you know you don't have enough cultists yet, you can still try to do the thing, just knowing you may not be able to make it. And a lot of the action types that you're going to find in this game are pretty standard things, or things that you would maybe expect to find in this game. So some of them will let you shift your figures around on the board so you can group up figures in places where you need more in order to outnumber investigators or take the stronger version of the action or something like that. One of them lets you get artifacts from the library, which are pretty powerful, right? Like you said, you had one that lets you up your hand limit.
Oh, yeah.
And having an increased hand limit in this game is crazy, because that allows you need the right color cards in your hand to be able to take the actions you need in the first place.
Right. I mean, they're spell cards, basically, and you need more cards typically to move around easily, to go where you want to possibly ready more spells that you can cast that lets you do more things. Yeah, it all works together.
Oh, yeah. I'd forgotten to mention the spell thing. So one side of the card is the symbol showing the space you can move to on the board. So you need more cards in your hand because you need like a variety of places to go. Because if you keep getting the same card over and over, which I guess could happen, then you're just going to keep feeding the investigator pool there. So you really need to change it up a little bit.
Right.
Plus, on the backside of each card is a spell. And they're really powerful abilities that you can unlock for yourself. And you can only use them one time after you unlock them. But they're usually a pretty big deal.
Yes.
And So you also have to balance, like, when you move to a new location, you put down an astral symbol at your location. And as you keep doing that, you'll stack up astral symbols at that spot where you are moving from. And if you're ever back in that spot, you can use the symbols that are there on the ground to unlock the spell. So you'll see at the top of the spell card the requirements that are needed to unlock it, and then you place it at the top of your board. And now you have this thing ready so that whenever you want to use it, you can. Plus, the other cool piece of this is each spell card has a color and has its own little astral symbol on it. And until you use it, it counts as a symbol of that type no matter what location you're in. So it's easier to ready more spells the more spells you have readied. It's a pretty neat little system, and it causes you to think about where you might want to move to from the location that you're in and ways that prepare you in the future for unlocking more spells. So there are a lot of little decisions that go into where you're moving around on the board. Then there are the location actions themselves. Those are pretty interesting, but like I said, pretty standard for the most part. There are two that I thought were pretty different. One of them is a space on the board where you can use your Elder God's special ability. So at the beginning of the game, you know, not only do you have a little Elder track or summoning track that shows how close you are to summoning this Elder God, but you also have the ability of that God. But you can't just use it any time. You have to go to this one specific location to use it, which sounds like a pain, and it can be, I guess, but they're really powerful abilities, so you want to go do this thing.
Oh, yeah. And I feel like most of the locations, like as far as solo play goes, they just kind of have a natural, I guess, cadence to it. Like you're going to want to kind of spread out between them, not because of just spreading out like where the investigators are, but also in just like you need to accomplish these actions. And so you can, change the order or kind of shortcut some things occasionally, but no space feels like, I felt like completely out of the way.
No, it doesn't. And they all feel mostly useful, I would say.
Yeah.
The Streets of Arkham even is useful for you in the solo game. That one is, in the multiplayer game, you're using it to send investigators from your lodge to somebody else's, basically throwing them off your trail and onto somebody else's. And I think in this, maybe you just use them to move them off your board.
Yeah, that is right.
It's kind of nice. If you ever are really getting in trouble with the investigators, you can take care of it that way.
Right.
But the other really interesting space on the board is the Other Worlds space. And it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is you can't just move there using a standard card. You need a special wild card. In order to get that, you have to go to one location on the board that hands out wild cards. Or you can take two of your cards of the same type and play them down as wild in order to access the Other Worlds. And when you get to the Other Worlds, that's when you have a chance to really advance your summoning track. So basically you get there, you look at how many investigators are in that space, and that tells you how many dice you can chuck to see if you advance your summoning track. And this is interesting, not only because it's one of the main ways to get victory points, or I guess to reach your end game goal, but also because if you're successful at advancing on the summoning track, the people that you've used to accomplish this thing are going to go into the abyss, which is the space in the middle of the board where you can't use those cultists anymore, at least until you take some action to like reach your hand into the abyss and pull them out,
right?
Or however, go fishing or something and catch a cultist. And you take them and you can put them back in your lodge where they're ready to be used. But that balance of trying to decide when is the right time for me to take this action so that I can roll the most dice possible, but also understanding that when I do that, there's a possibility you could just lose all of the cultists you have on your space. I mean, it's not likely, but it's possible.
Do you lose them all for each one that you roll on?
One side of the die, you advance on the summoning track and you lose your cultist. Another side of the die, you advance on the summoning track, but he doesn't go into the abyss.
Right, but if you don't get either success, they just stay there.
They just stay there.
Okay,
yeah, so
right.
They do keep building up, which is nice. I really like that little balance that not only do you have to manage where you're going, but now you also have to manage, okay, do I have enough people in my lodge now to be able to take the actions I want to take? Or do I need to take an action to get them out of the abyss? I don't know. It's lots of interesting things to think about there too.
Yeah, it's just a lot of good decisions to make.
Yeah, I would say so. And that combined with your fear of raids and how the elder signs, that they lay down can mess you up as you're trying to move up your summoning track. All that works together really well in a way that, I don't know, I felt like the mechanics for this game just sort of melt away after a while, and it feels very thematic. As thematic, I would say, as maybe Eldritch Horror, just in a different sort of way. There are a lot of different things to think about here and a lot of things to puzzle out on your turn, but I don't want to make it sound like it's a really heavy experience, because it's not really.
No, it's not bad. It's not a brain burner or anything like that.
No, and it's pleasantly thinky, I would say. You can play this later at night and not feel like you're going to fall asleep at the table, which is something that I do with some regularity when I try to play heavier games too late at night. That hasn't happened to me with this game.
Oh, yeah.
It's pleasantly thinky. And once you get into a rhythm, you're going to start really moving and being able to accomplish the things you need to do and dodging the investigators most of the time and taking a calculated risk every now and then that will move some of them to your lodge. But there's one random element that happens at the end of every turn that's going to keep you on your toes. And that is that at the end of your turn, the fate piece for the AI player is going to move to whatever the top card on the draw deck is. And you never know what that card is going to be during your turn. So what's interesting about this is that if it moves to your space, you're going to get a curse card. And you can only have that happen 5 times before the game is done. So there's like a timer here as far as, how many of these you can afford to take. Plus there's the Elder Sign timer too.
Right. And there are ways to remove curses also with some spells.
Oh, yeah, there are. I never actually ran across those in my games.
Oh, okay.
Because there's a substantial deck of spells there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you're just using them for moving to locations, you don't actually... you may not pay as much attention to the spells on the other side.
Right.
Probably should, but I didn't. Anyway, so there's that random element too. And I thought that part of the game, how you manage the AI player, was super simple.
Yeah, it just doesn't really take any thought. It's just very, I know what's going to happen to move it here, add investigators, blah, 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 whatever.
Yeah, it's a little bit fiddly where you have to constantly be putting out investigators on the board and things like that. But that's not too bad, I don't think.
Yeah.
But the only thing I would say here that I'm not crazy about the solo game is that the game is just too easy.
Yeah, it really is.
I'm saying that as somebody who's generally has a hard time the first couple times I play a game. I just don't expect to win. I won this handily every time that I played it. And that's a real problem for me.
Yeah. It's one of those things that I really enjoyed it a lot while I was playing. But just with the current solo rules, it's hard to imagine getting a ton of replayability out of it just because it's not challenging enough.
Yeah, I really, really want them to include a difficulty adjustment thing in the rulebook, but it's just not there for the solo game. And yeah, it just hurts me a little bit because I think that the things that are going on in this game are really interesting. And I'm just going to say right now, I think this game is vastly underrated and that it's criminally overlooked. But I'm probably not going to revisit it anytime in the near future just because of the difficulties not there. And I don't think I would enjoy this as a multiplayer experience because it has a little bit too much that's erased in the single player game, but the single player game just isn't hard enough.
Yeah, it's one of those things that if it was maybe a little more constrained with kind of, there's not resource gathering, but just accomplishing your goals, because there'd be easy ways to, I think, ratchet up the difficulty in sense of, oh, you lose if you have 3 curse cards or you put out more investigators, but that doesn't seem like it would be a fun challenge.
That's exactly right. There's ways of adjusting difficulty that are interesting and make you think about the game in new ways, I think. And then there's that. And that's just a little too simple. So I really want them to include something like this in an expansion, or maybe they have already. There's apparently an expansion out for this that we don't have. And maybe they made some adjustments there. I do know that you can go on to Board Game Geek, and a couple people have tried to make variants that increase the difficulty. So one of them that we looked at that seemed the most interesting to me is you use a little token from the game to sort of make revolutions around the outside of the board. So the first time it makes a trip around the board, nothing really happens. But when it starts its second trip around the board, then you place out 2 investigators on a spot every time you visit one or the fate piece visits one. And that would definitely make it more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And if you haven't completed the game by the time it finishes the third revolution, you just lose the game. So that seems good, but I didn't have any trouble with the speed of the game. I felt like I was kind of sprinting toward the finish line. I don't think 3 revolutions is going to make a big difference for me personally.
Yeah.
And each of the Elder Gods does play differently. And so they do present different sorts of puzzles for you, but I never felt like one of them increased the challenge in a way that was compelling for me. So I don't know, maybe other people feel differently about this, but it lacked a little something for me to really enjoy it long term.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the time that I spent with it, but I don't feel a need to play it again, which is a little bit sad because the game does have a lot of great variability in the setup and replayability in terms of using the different gods that are in the game, because there are several gods in here. They all seem pretty interesting to me. There are a couple that look like they're not really playable with the solo experience, like their special ability applies more to a multiplayer setting, but the majority of them you could play solo with. I really like that. I like how they all feel different, that their powers are very cool and they feel like you're doing a big thing on your turn when you use them. And so I think all of those things combined would lead to very different feeling games if the difficulty was there. I think that's pretty much all we need to say about the game, right? You want to move into the good and the bad and the ugly for this one?
Let's do it.
All right. So on the good for me, this has several really great points. Number one, the production is such a pleasant surprise here. Really well done. I think you get a lot in the box for what you're paying for it. And not only in terms of physical components, but also in terms of puzzle complexity for how you take the different actions you take on your turn. The other thing I would say that's really nice about this is it's just not like anything else I've played before.
Yeah, just a very different way of moving around, and just, I guess, the dual purpose of the spell cards as movement and also as potential actions.
Yeah, each individual mechanic is familiar, but together it feels different. Plus, the setup time is quick. The playtime was very quick, I thought. It took me about 45 minutes to play a game.
Yeah, probably. That sounds right.
Yeah, so really pleasant length. The rules are easy, and lots of different Elder Gods included in the box, so there's lots of replayability there. My favorite thing here, though, is just how thematic it is. I was really intrigued by this theme of playing the other side of these Lovecraftian mysteries, and I was pleased to find that the theme really shines through in the game.
Yeah. I know you said whenever you saw the box in person, you really liked the art and it intrigued you. I was not very excited based on the box art. And I mean, I wasn't like dreading the game, but it was one of those things I wasn't, I guess, intrigued or compelled to play it.
Sure.
But yeah, the more I played it, like as I was playing through the first game, I was really drawn in a lot more than I was expected and enjoyed it a whole lot.
Yeah, I think if you like Lovecraftian horror and if you think that you might play this with other people for the most part and maybe occasionally play it solo, then this would be a really good fit for you because, I don't know, it feels like it could sit alongside games like Eldritch Horror and Mansions of Madness in somebody's collection and not feel redundant.
Right, because it's not the same type of drawing a card from a deck, reading off a random thing, a random event. It's much more like, the area control, movement, action thing, and it's playing from the perspective of the bad guys.
Right, it is. And that to me is compelling enough, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether that differentiates itself enough to make it a fit for your collection is something you're going to have to think about because there are a couple of bad things that we want to mention here. For me, one bad thing I'll mention is that the artwork on the Elder God cards is a little weird. I don't know how to describe it. It just doesn't look as good as the rest of the game. The game board and the game cover and everything look great. The art of the actual gods looks kind of meh for me. But otherwise, that's a pretty minor complaint as far as art direction and all that stuff goes. That's the only bad thing I have to say about this game, really. Okay. There is one majorly ugly thing for me, and it's what you probably already suspect, and that is that the game's just too easy. It's too easy for us to fully recommend or to give the Solosaurus stamp of approval to just based on what's here in the box. Now, I say that with the caveat that there are these different attempts on the Board Game Geek forums to try to make the game more difficult, and maybe that is enough for you, and you're so intrigued by everything else that's in the box, and rightfully so, I would say, that you would think that this is worth a shot. If so, that's great. We encourage you to, go for it. But I don't love this game, mostly because it's just not hard enough.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I am too.
So that's all we've really got to say about The Fate of the Elder Gods. Really interesting game, vastly underrated, overlooked. You should definitely check it out, especially if you're mostly going to use it as a multiplayer experience and you think that you're okay with some take that in your games. It's definitely one to look at. For solo-only players, I'm not sure I can recommend it. So that's all we've got for you this episode. If you haven't yet, go on to our Facebook page. You can follow us there and see what games we're playing and what we're up to. The same thing is true of our Instagram account. Our handle is @Solosaurus Podcast. You can follow us there if you want to see pictures of what we're doing and what we're playing. If you haven't yet, go on to iTunes and review the show. If you go on there and leave us a review, I know it sounds like a silly thing, but it does actually make the podcast easier to find. And the easier it is to find, the more we can do with the show. And finally, if you haven't yet, send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, we might end up featuring them on the show. You can email us at solosaurus@gmail.com. So if you have a question you want to send our way, feel free to do that. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Brandon Waite.
I'm Carter Mackey.
And this is Solosaurus.